Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest who just published a new book. His name is Jason Horsley. I've had a couple of interviews with him in the past. His new book is titled Divisive Kings: How Socialism, Occultism, and the Sexual Revolution Engineered a Culture of Abuse. It's a 2-hour discussion. This is the first hour. Both hours can be found on my YouTube channel at William Ramsey Investigates. Thank you for listening. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. His name is Jason Horsley. He's just published a book titled Divisive Kings, and it will be the third time he has been on my show. We've done other shows in the past regarding his other books, the titles of which we did a show about John DeRuyter, who was a kind of mystical guy he was in Canada. And let's see, Jason. I had that link ready. Now I don't have
Dark Oasis.
The title of the book is Dark Oasis, The Self-Made Messiah Unveiled. So we did an interview on that. We also talked last year, 2018, about his published book, Prisoner of Infinity, UFOs, Social Engineering, and the Psychology of Fragmentation. And just this year, published on Amazon January 1st, is again Divisive Kings: How Socialism, Occultism, and the Sexual Revolution Engineered a Culture of Abuse. So, Jason Horsley, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill. Good to be back.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. A great book, by the way. Really enjoyed it. Loved it. Another one of your many great books. And maybe we can just get started about how you kind of conceptualized this book and where the kind of seed of writing this book came from.
Well, there were two C's, really. I mean, as you know, there's two parts to the book, and hopefully they do come together and they make a coherent whole, but they are quite separate at the same time. And the first part, Occult Yorkshire, is based on investigations into my family history and how that led me into a whole can of worms relating to the Fabian Society and psychosocial, psychosexual engineering. So try and coin new terms there because it's a mishmash of these different areas of research and social manipulations, and centering around, as well as my own family history, Jimmy Savile as a kind of microchipped eel, if you will, that wherever Jimmy Savile goes, you know that you're going to encounter these networks of power because he was so closely affiliated with that. And of course, he's now recognized as a prolific child sexual abuser and other things. So there was the main focus there, and that was an ongoing thing for me over the past several years, this growing interest in child sexual abuse. And then part two was seeded actually by just a thread at the forum Rigorous Intuition that I called the Crowley joke, which is now the title of part two of the book. It was about this supposed joke that Crowley made in Magic Theory and Practice about how he sacrificed a child at regular intervals for 25 years. I forget the exact specifics of it, but it came out at thousands and thousands of supposed child sacrifices, and allegedly the official version of that was that he was just joking and he was talking about masturbation. And so I just brought that up as an example of a tip of an iceberg around Crowley and occultism, and juxtaposing with Jimmy Savile's tendency, which became known after the truth came out, after he died, that he would make jokes about what he was doing as a way to give a kind of a nudge and a wink to the people who knew, and to, in a sense, conceal what he was doing to those who didn't, via a kind of double bluff, I suppose. That if he were really doing such things, he certainly wouldn't be joking about it. But it turned out he was doing them, and he was joking about them. And I think I discovered the same about Crowley. Maybe not literally in terms of child sacrifice. I didn't find any evidence of that, but certainly the equivalent in terms of atrocities that he just concealed with this supposedly mischievous, malevolent humor. So anyway, that was roughly an inception of these two investigations that I then brought together for Vice of Kings when it came time to make it into a book.
And you had kind of uncovered quite a few quotes and references that Crowley made, not just that kind of famous quote that he had in Magic and Theory and Practice, but also there was one from the Magical Record of the Beast, of which you referenced, which was really a note that he was taught in the Abbey of Thelema. One note between him and he had two paramours at that time, right around 1923, which are Hersig was one of the names, and Nanette Shumway. And maybe I can just say in the outright that there's some very disturbing content we'll probably be talking about. So if people are sensitive to that or are uncomfortable with, really disturbing topics like child sacrifice, child abuse of the worst sort, I do not recommend you listen, or definitely do not listen to this discussion in the presence of children or anything like that. So, but getting back to that statement that you had discovered, which was, something that maybe we should use as a reference point for this kind of theme that you have going through your book, which is this abuse. But maybe we can get that. That's really the second part of the book. I think maybe we should start with not just the inception of the book, but how you kind of couched your investigation from your own past, which, you're growing up in Yorkshire, but also being the grandson of really a British business magnate and his connections. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Right. Well, so I didn't know very much about the kind of world my grandfather was embedded in while I was growing up. I just saw the surface, the tip of the iceberg. I knew he was involved in the peace movement. I knew he was self-identified as a socialist. I knew he hobnobbed with celebrities. I didn't know anything about his affiliation with the Fabian Society. That would not have meant anything to me growing up. Obviously, I knew he was a businessman, although, my father had taken over the reins pretty much by the time I came along. I remember, one of his claims to fame, although he didn't, he didn't, actually he de-emphasized his social influence in many ways. In other ways, he seemed like he was quite proud of it, and he was a bit of a name dropper and things of that sort. But in other ways, it turns out that he de-emphasized or he downplayed it. But one of the examples of how influential I think he was the CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, was an early peace movement in the 50s and the 60s in Britain. Maybe it started in the 60s actually, but very early 60s if so. And the symbol for the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament is it's now on Craigslist. They've kind of co-opted it, but that three-pronged thing, the peace symbol, everybody knows it still, even from the 60s, right? That was actually just co-designed by my grandfather.
Interesting.
And
his name was Alec Horsley, correct? Alec?
Yeah, Alec Horsley. And he was born of seemingly working class roots, but I'm not so sure I believe that anymore. He went to Oxford and he went to Nigeria as a district officer. And, the more I looked into him, the more I saw how he was rubbing shoulders with the very elite, the British elite, including, chairman of the Bank of England and somebody who went on to host the Bilderberg meetings in the early days of the Bilderberg. So, definite high-powered players. And that was all quite surprising to me to realize just how connected he had been. And as I say, I just picked up a very superficial thing here, but with the example of the CND thing, like I was an early proponent of CND and peace, and I would wear the CND badge. I didn't even know that he designed it. It's weird. You'd think he would have said, "Oh, I had a hand in that." But the reason I wore it was that when he saw me wearing it, my grandfather would give me £1, and I was a very mercenary kid, and so I had that mercenary incentive to pose as a peacenik, even though I didn't really feel that strongly about it, but I would accept the bribes from my grandfather. And, looking back, it does seem like a kind of microcosm that he would be that cynical, and that I would, about the whole thing. And I now think that the peace movement was partially, if not primarily, designed by social engineers as a way to neutralize real revolt of the working class that would be violent and that would disrupt things, because they want the trains to be running on time and so on and so forth. They don't want the working class up in arms, and they certainly don't want them causing rioting and stuff, which can cost a lot in damages.
Right.
So I think that my grandfather was part of a social engineering program of the aristocracy, which included Bertrand Russell, who's a friend of Gandhi, and Gandhi was a pioneer of this passive or peaceful resistance thing, deliberately in order to co-opt and redirect any kind of uprisings in Britain during that time and redirect them down more peaceful channels. So it seemed like a benevolent thing, and in some ways you could say it is, but you can also see how it was serving the interests of the ruling class. And I think that was the case with my grandfather throughout. I don't know how consciously is the thing. I don't know how Machiavellian a character he was and how much he himself was duped. In the case of my father, I think he was very much duped. But in the case of my grandfather, I suspect he was more conscious.
More conscious. He was very well educated at Oxford, correct? So he kind of was within that orbit of all those kind of the highest intellectual currents of the country, right? The UK.
Yeah, and he was a proud intellectual. My father was too, but my father, he didn't drop out of Oxford, but he just got a third. He just
coasted through.
Yeah, he didn't really care about it, but he was involved in peace movements. He would march to Alderston, I think that's the name of it. So as a young man, he was definitely involved in peace movements, and he did adopt his father's values, including, this intellectualism and the exaggerated respect for the intellectual pursuits and the arts and stuff.
But I think that sets the stage from kind of what you grew up in, which was the kind of socialistic, liberal, kind of maybe the upper class view of those views in the UK. Would you agree with that? That if the upper class, they still didn't really, they adhered to those values, but they really didn't mix maybe with as much as they weren't as cohesive across class boundaries. Would you agree with that?
Well, no, of course not. And generally, aristocracy isn't expected to mingle with the working class. But in my case, it wasn't an aristocracy. I call it a closet aristocracy, and that might be putting it too boldly. I'm sure that surviving family members would scoff at that, or maybe they're lying. I don't know. But certainly, there was an elitism in my family, and great wealth and power, and they all lived in mansions. I grew up in a mansion. So, and when people at school, people asked, or the teacher asked, which class do people identify with? Almost everyone in my class said middle class. I think everyone, and I said upper class.
Interesting.
But that would have upset my father probably, or he would have denied and said, we're not upper class. They definitely pretended to be middle, or at least upper middle class, and they definitely espoused socialist values, which was sympathy for the common man, for the working man. But no, they didn't mingle. None of the people that I knew growing up who hung out with my father or my grandfather, well, I shouldn't say none, but probably might have been a few exceptions in terms of people that they worked with as a dairy and a food business.
Right.
A little bit of an overlap there, but generally speaking, it was all working class. And Yes, intelligentsia. And there was definitely elitism was the norm growing up. I inherited an elitist view. I considered ordinary people, common people, to be beneath me.
Kind of like
And
commoners mentality, kind of British
yes,
class system. And your grandfather Alex started Northern Dairy, and
yeah.
then your father ran that, and kind of the company went public as Northern Foods, right? Really a food conglomerate.
It was a gradual thing. I mean, it went public before it became Northern Foods. It started as a private dairy and then went public at the time of the Suez Crisis, which may not be coincidental. And by that time, my grandfather was clearly very connected with, as I say, these high power political, social engineering type characters. And there's no doubt that the food industry, the food production itself, is very central to geopolitics. How could it not be, right? But this is certainly something that never occurred to me until I started looking at my past through this lens. That the ascent of Northern dairies, and its transformation into Northern Foods under my father, and then later, and sort of simultaneously, and later Chris Haskins, who was my father's brother-in-law, who later went on to be the rural Tsar for Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Britain, and he's now a lord. That all of that went parallel with Northern Foods becoming more and more openly connected to, I would say, geopolitical movements. So albeit not overtly. I mean, they were always just a corporation. They never politically platformed, but I think you can see the way in which corporations, or that corporation is an example of how government and corporations work together.
Right, but I guess what I'm trying to say is like that background was where this kind of idea of the Fabian socialists gestated. Really was kind of this intellectual upper class of which Alec was kind of rotating, grouped with. And, can you describe how the Fabians got their name and what the ideas of Fabian socialism, the basic ideas were?
Well, the latter is quite difficult because they're symbols of wolf in sheep's clothing. So they have they have an open philosophy that they espouse, and then they have the wolf that's hidden inside it, and it's quite hard to untangle them. And the former, in simple terms of how they got their name, that was Emperor Fabius, or the general, I beg your pardon, wasn't an emperor. And that was a military strategy of this Roman general in terms of how to conquer and colonize other communities, other cultures, incrementally through slow pressure terrorist tactics. I think he was an early example of the use of terror tactics, also starving out the enemy, infiltration, and so on. And anyway, but the basic idea of Fabian was to transform society incrementally through implementation and pressure, and I would say through deep social, psychosocial, and psychosexual study of individuals and groups, and then the application of those principles towards long-term goals, always under the guise of a benevolent philanthropic push. So,
right.
So one example I give in the book, as you read, is Bertrand Russell. Although I don't think he self-identified as a Fabian, he was definitely on the same team in terms of contributing to these agendas. And he wrote quite a bunch of books, and he's known to this day as a humanitarian, as a philosopher, albeit an atheist philosopher, but one who is a humanistic kind of philosopher. But if you look at some of his work, such as the Scientific Outlook, which I analyze in the book, you can see that under the guise of writing a cautionary analysis of where society might be going if we don't watch out, he's basically presented a blueprint for how to direct society in order to attain these ends, a blueprint for a future society that ostensibly he's warning the reader about. And I used it because I think it's a very good example of this wolf in sheep's clothing policy, that a book like that, I believe, was written with two audiences in mind. One was the intelligentsia, who would understand that he was one of them, and he was out laying out some of the primary principles of psychosocial engineering in order to build slowly towards this future society. And then the second audience was the masses, most of them wouldn't read Bertrand Russell, but still, the students and whatnot who weren't part of the elite, who would take it as a cautionary tale.
Right. What was the title of that book again?
A Scientific Outlook.
A Scientific Outlook. That's right. Yeah. So, that's one example of that. The Fabianism. I think, and you put some interesting quotes from John Taylor Gatto's book that are interspersed throughout the beginning of those chapters that describes that even American educational systems are Fabian. I mean, he references that kind of Fabian ideal through the American educational system, right?
Right, and I think it's quite topical now because I'm sure you're aware of all the controversy around universities in the US and Canada, and how much they seem to have betrayed the principles of good education and be more about ideological indoctrination, and even the humanities and the sciences are all being undermined by ideological agendas such as transgenderism and others, and that this is in one of the principles of Fabianism that I mentioned in the book, which is the weaponization of university professors. And it's also a good example of how Fabians work. They infiltrate positions of influence within society with their own agendas, and then they use those positions to, having infiltrated the institution, to then infiltrate the policies or shape and influence the policies and the ideologies and the methodologies of a given institution towards these hidden ends of Fabianism, which one of them could be summed up as destabilizing society, fracturing the family unit in order to be able to remold society along more overtly scientific lines, such as outlined in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. I mean, that's a very simplified blueprint, I think.
Right, but I mean, I think that's an interesting strain within the kind of Fabian socialist, is that there is a goal of a scientific reordering of society, but not necessarily as beneficial to all segments of that society, right? Some of these, you wrote about the entitlements as a Fabian insertion into social fabric, which most people on the surface think is beneficial, but actually, decreases incentive and initiative, right? So a lot.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think it's premised on the belief that the intelligentsia, so to speak, that they see themselves as inherently, intrinsically different to and superior to the vast mass of humanity. And so many of these agendas are directed consciously towards accentuating that split and directing more and more power and prestige and advantage and advancement to their own cliques of the elite, and stripping the rest of the mass of the little that they do have of autonomy, of discernment, of intelligence, of health, and towards a bifurcation, as is outlined in H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, isn't it? And he was also a Fabian for a period where you have the Eloi and the Morlocks.
Right.
I think and Bertrand Russell writes about this also in the Scientific Outlook. By the way, I make the distinction here between scientific and scientistic, that essentially the use of scientific data and scientific methods as a means to indoctrinate, and with an ideological thrust in this case, is really scientism, because it's not simply about finding out the truth and then adhering to it. It's about, I suppose it's a selective use of knowledge, isn't it, in order
Right.
to control.
Right. And claim it's science by manipulating people or, putting those things out. Yeah. I thought what was of particular interest, the thing that when you referenced that David Rockefeller did his senior thesis on Fabian socialism at Harvard, titled Destitution Through Fabian Eyes. And it's this idea through the Fabians, as you talked about, as the Jesuits of socialism, that they're co-opting both sides of the political spectrum. So they're trying to get in. And I found that to be very interesting because you can kind of see the modern political, post-50s, post-World War II, modern political environment is really being dictated by the Rockefellers. All these people are associated with the Rockefellers, both the left and the right, whether it's Bill Clinton or the Bush family. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it is remarkable how many roads lead to the Rockefellers, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, it's pretty, I mean, it goes all the way to 9/11, all through all that stuff. But maybe we can talk about John Maynard Keynes, Havelock, Ellis, probably names, probably not, people might have heard of Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, but not Havelock, Ellis, and how this kind of set the groundwork for your later inquiry into child sexual abuse.
Yeah. I mean, Ellis, I hadn't really heard of Havelock Ellis, barely, but most people have heard of Alfred Kinsey, I think. Has famously wrote these books on male and female and child sexuality in probably the late 50s, but anyway, it's attributed to the sexual revolution is accredited to Kinsey and his supposed scientific discoveries. Again, an example of scientism rather than science, because Kinsey, his methods were not just, debatable, they were absolutely unethical, they were even criminal.
Yeah.
And then the way
they were never analyzed by a third party either. He never gave his research up to third party, inquiry. So that was another, among his other very criminal acts. But yeah, Kinsey was something else.
So, and certainly it's a lot easier to see with Kinsey how his supposed findings, his presentations, the data that he presented and the publications he released were used for social engineering purposes in order to kickstart the sexual revolution. With Ellis, he's much less known, and it was at a much earlier phase. He was one of the founding Fabians, who were talking in the 1880s. When he was doing his research, he was certainly ahead of his time. He coined the term homosexual. I'm not quite sure about pedophile, but certainly this would have been in the early days of, defining or categorizing these orientations, we have to call them now. He was, as you can imagine, and as with Kinsey, somebody who's a sexologist, who's a researcher into human sexual behavior, he was particularly interested in what was considered to be human perversion. And of course, this is the tail end of the Victorian era, with all of that moral and sexual repression. At least that's how we're, led to look at it now. Yeah. Some of it was just hygiene and conscientiousness and upstanding values, of course, but there definitely was an element of repression. There's no doubt about that, and all kinds of other debatable attitudes. And somebody like Ellis, of course, he has to, as did Freud, he has to push against that tide and be willing to be scientific or objective and just look at human sexuality in all its forms without making value judgments. But actually, he, like Kinsey, and maybe it's to do with a predilection for the subject matter, he went to the other extreme and he developed the attitude and I'd say the philosophy, even though he's not really known for this as a philosophy, just an opinion, but still I think it is a philosophical position, that human sexual perversion is an expression of freedom of the human spirit. And whether he genuinely believed that, or whether it was understood that this is a way to dissolve boundaries within society and thereby destabilize the society and undermine the family unit, because of course it does. If you have a man and a woman and children, and the sexual revolution, and then it's all about free love. Well, the intimacy, the loyalty, the fidelity, all these things are lost, supposedly in the interests of the freedom, self-expression, the freedom, just freedom of all the varieties, right? As though somehow just, being in a more ordinary, conventional family relationship is restricting of the life force. Well, it might be, but it isn't necessarily. And
right. Crowley would say there is no sin but restriction, right? So you could see Havelock Ellis as an ideological precursor to Crowley's ideas. Although
absolutely, yeah. So and we could also say that this was an idea whose time has come, that it was something growing in the collective psyche as perhaps, a reaction against repression. When there's too much repression, as we know in our own lives, there's a corresponding kickback, and then we push, too far in the other direction.
The pendulum swings back, yeah.
Right. And that can be understood for social engineering purposes, as I've talked about, maybe even with you on previous occasions. Yes, if you want a sexual revolution, well, first repress people so that energy is just dying for, to come out. But by the same token, if you want a clamp down and, to lay the groundwork for a very oppressive society, create a sexual revolution. And
interesting. Right. There's no 60s without the 50s, I would say. Right, the 60s were a revolution against the 50s, kind of straight-laced stuff.
That's right, and then there were the 80s, which were very oppressive in their way, and of course AIDS didn't come out of nowhere.
Right, but I think Havelock Ellis really, like the branches of his influence. You write about John Maynard Keynes and also Nabokov, so you can see Havelock Ellis as this precursor to Lolita, and that whole thing. But what talk about how Havelock Ellis influenced John Maynard Keynes and why Keynes is important.
Well, I don't feel very qualified there, Bill, even though it's in my book, because economics is not my strong suit. So yeah, I mean, I prefer to go back to the Nabokov thing because I feel more qualified there, because it's the area of the arts. So, I read Lolita myself. I was in my 20s, and of course I saw the Kubrick movie. And then there was a later movie with Jeremy Irons, and Lolita has entered the vernacular. So I think it's a good example, and there are university studies around the sexual child with Lolita as a key text. And this all came on the heels of Freud, not just Ellis, but Freud, about that children are sexual, as again a counterposition or reaction against the Victorian view, which kind of erased children completely, never mind allowing that they were sexual beings. They weren't allowed to be human beings. And so I think Freud overcompensated for that by saying, well, children do exist, they do have libido, so they can have sexual responses. But then that became something quite distorted via Ellis, via Nabokov, Lolita, that a child is a sexual being in the sense that a child can have sexual desire as opposed to sexual responses, which is something very different. And this is like what Kinsey did. He took children and he sexually abused them. He sexually interfered with them, and of course they had responses. And not only that, I mean, not only did he force responses out of them, but he misinterpreted, probably deliberately. If they were crying and panting, he'd said that was a sexual response as opposed to, a response of grief.
Fear and terror, trauma, right. Just exactly. Absolute terror. And I mean, we can get into the details of his experiments, but they are like Nazi-level, terrifying, non-consensual abuse of infants, really. It's really infant abuse, which, I don't know what the term is, infant abuse or something like that. But, Lolita is an interesting point, because I've been reading some of the inside stuff about Kubrick, who was pals with Arthur Clarke. Both of them worked on 2001, but both of them have a pedophile history. Arthur C. Clarke's was very obvious and written about in British journalism. It was pretty much suppressed, but he was in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, having a ping pong. he actually financed a ping pong place where he would then find boys and pay them money. And there's a ping pong thing within Lolita, and Kubrick apparently was having sex with the Lolita girl, that he was abusing her. That's how she got the role, and that's why these themes of pedophilia go from Lolita to Eyes Wide Shut. So the end of Eyes Wide Shut and all this other stuff. And there's actually a hint of pedophilia, of sexual abuse in The Shining, that the father was sexually abusing the boy, not just broke his arm, but there was a hint of like something worse.
So where did you hear that about Kubrick and the
Crazy Days and Nights? Crazy Days and Nights reported him as having a very extensive child porn collection, and that he was a pedophile. I can send you the link. And I mean, granted, you got to take that with a grain of salt, but you can see the current of that issue suffuse and go through Kubrick. So.
Well, I'd definitely be interested in that. And Crazy Days and Nights does seem a more credible source than others in terms of being an insider. So yeah, do send me the link. I do want to point out, as I do in Vice of Kings, that there's a danger. Again, it's a bit like the pendulum, but it's also part of the social engineering trap, I think, around pedophilia, which is there's a danger of using the term too loosely. So in the case of Clark, he may have been a pedophile, but he was technically, what we know, he was a pederast.
Okay.
He had sex with young boys or whatever. It's difficult, the terminology, but as in probably around 12, 13, 14. So I think technically that's a hebephile or a pederast. And I think it is important to make this distinction because, as you know, we live in a weird culture in which, on the one hand, there's more and more defense of and normalization of sex with children, and on the other hand, the hysteria and the hatred and the rage and the indignation continues, unabated. And I think the two actually feed into each other, and it's only possible because it's such a difficult subject, and most people don't really want to look at it closely, and they can't look at it dispassionately.
Right, it's a very difficult subject. Can you see this post that I put on, so we can read it? I think it's possible I may have found a director who's even worse than Oscar-winning A-list director that has been in the space frequently, or Woody Allen. The director of which I'm speaking is an Oscar winner, not for what you might think. It shockingly actually does not have more Oscar wins. He raped 3 tweens during a casting process and gave the role to the tween he said was the one who was the best in bed. He later ordered her to sleep with a much, much older foreign co-star of the movie, who went on to have an A-list career. The director kept her around for a couple of years under the guise of getting her more roles, but the real reason was he could send her out to find other tweens and early teens to bring back to his place, where he would get them drunk or slip them drugs and then rape them. He often filmed these rapes and would film the actress with the other tween and teen females. In the movie for which is most famous, he had friends of one of his children come to the set with a child. All the friends were probably no older than 7 or 8. He molested a dozen of them at least during the filming of the movie and filmed many of them. When he died, there were hundreds of hours of footage, which were some of the most extreme versions of child porn anywhere. Stanley Kubrick, Peter Sellers.
So which one's Peter Sellers in there? What's the reference to
Wasn't
Peter?
Sellers in Lolita? Maybe he wasn't.
He was, yeah, but is that the foreign? But that can't be the foreign-born co-star, can it? Because Sellers was English, so maybe it is. But
I don't know. Well, who was Humbert? What was his name?
That was James Mason, but he was already an A-lister. Maybe it is a reference to Sellers.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that's what they said. So, yeah, that's pretty disturbing. So, I mean, then things become, you see that Arthur Clarke and Kubrick are peas in a pod, right? Both of these guys have this, and super influential, right? Both Kubrick and Arthur Clarke are these pederast, whatever, and influencing, social engineering the culture through all their films and everything.
I certainly think that Kubrick was a social engineer, yeah, well, any way you slice it. I mean, and it's not, somebody who doesn't get known as the world's greatest filmmaker, and without obviously having a great deal of influence, but also a great deal of power.
So you can trace Havelock, Ellis through Nabokov through Kubrick, so you can go back to these British, really the pre-Kinsey sexologist in Havelock, Ellis. It's pretty amazing.
Yes. Yeah, and I think the reason I wanted to linger on Nabokov and Lolita is that I think possibly it's because a lot of the Fabians were artists, the writers, George Bernard Shaw, the most famous, H.G. Wells. Nabokov, as far as I know, wasn't a Fabian, but Lolita was massively influential, and it seems to me that maybe an example of how the Fabian Society or social engineers in general, how they operate in terms of they do the research, they discover the data, they collect the data that they figure that they can use and implement in society. They determine a method in order to use that knowledge for the desired end, and then they look for a public figure, somebody who can be made a very powerful, influential figure to create the delivery device. In this case, Lolita. Like if you think about Lolita, it even, as I said, brought a word into the language. It kind of opened up the collective psyche to this idea of the sexualized child. Okay, Lolita wasn't a total child; she was 12, no. Right. But the main thing about Lolita was she was more of the seducer than the seduced.
In the book, right? In
the book,
right. That's the way it's portrayed. Yeah, I mean, but still, it's still like it's still scandalous. It's still pedophilia, right?
Well, I mean, it's still trauma. It still generates trauma, and it's. I mean, it's, as I say, it's very complex, the whole thing. But when I grew up, the Lolita, it's a sexual idea. I mean, I didn't think this book is about a child who's being abused, and there's that it's about trauma and it's a tragedy,
grooming and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, and it certainly didn't. There was no indication it was about deeply embedded child trafficking and child pornography and systematized, organized ritual abuse in all the world that you and I are familiar with and that I write about in Vice of Kings. It was completely taken out of that context, and the context that somehow it fitted into was more of a pornographic one, in which children are potentially sexual beings and very erotic. So the term Lolita actually became, what you call a sexually promiscuous girl. It's a turn on. If somebody's a Lolita, that there's something attractive and appealing about that. So
which didn't exist before, right? Didn't exist before Nabokov.
Well, no. I mean, it might have existed in society, but it wasn't.
It wasn't
being normalized.
Distilled into a name, right? Gotcha.
It wasn't being normalized, yeah. And the thing about Lolita, of course, is it was also a key book, as was D.H. Lawrence's work, Lady Chatterley's Lover, and actually George Bernard Shaw with Pygmalion, a book that, or a work that pushed the envelope in terms of censorship. Because,
right. Because the Lolita was censored, right? Wasn't it one of the more heavily censored books?
Yeah, I think Lolita, like Lady Chatterley's Lover, there was an attempt to suppress it and ban it. And because it was art, because it was literature, then the laws about what's acceptable in society had to be changed in order to make room for this great literary work. The same with George Bernard Shaw, Pygmalion. He just used the word bloody, so it seems very quaint to us now. Lady Chatterley's Lover, they used the word fuck, and the sex scenes, and so on. So I think, in terms of Fabian permeators, as they call themselves, if you imagine somebody who's part of a covert organization that has this long-term agenda and a philosophy and has a literary talent, and then goes to work to create a work that will be a delivery device for certain values, and then that's like a bomb, really. You lob it into society. Maybe it's got a long fuse, but once it goes off, the fallout just enters into every area of society. I mean, we're talking about works that have much more influence than, probably just about anything, really. I mean, art has a way of sort of spanning the whole spectrum of society.
Right. That's true. Under the banner of art, right? Still has social issues, psychological issues, historical.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like Brave New World obviously is another great example. Like how influential has that book been? And what's the real influence? Because if you look at the world, we're certainly getting closer and closer to what he prophesied. And many people see that simply as, wow, how prophetic he was, how much foresight and insight he had. But they don't think, well, wait a minute, if he's such a great writer and a great book, how come the warning didn't take? How come we just completely ignored it?
Right. Well, it's the going back to George Bernard Shaw, right? For one people, it's a warning. For other, it's a blueprint, right? Probably maybe 1984 is the same way. Like in a lot of ways, you could see 1984 being created under the Bush administration with, their own Goldstein and Osama bin Laden and all these people. Just 2 minutes of hate, tons of booze and drugs everywhere.
That's total
propaganda, fake wars. I mean, really, if you look at, like, even Putin said 95% of terrorist acts are carried out by the CIA. That means that your own government is creating that environment that they're complaining about, right? So they're coming from both sides. So that's where it gets scary, where these books are not merely dystopian, but they're not prophetic. They're blueprints. They're outlines, right?
Yeah, and it does beg the question of how helpful is it to. It's like the revelation of the method idea. I don't think there's anything like that in 1984, but you can imagine that there could be.
Well, in some of that, I think all the Ministry of Truth, Ministry of Justice, and Ministry, what was the other one? They're all in pyramids, right? So you have like this occult symbolism that he's putting out there. And Room 101, just all kinds of strange...
Well, I was just thinking about the idea that if you let people know incrementally what's going on in the nature of society that they're in, they will lose hope. They will lose all hope, and they will just become docile and compliant, and they will take the medication, right?
Take the pill, yeah.
Brave New World. So you can see 1984 and Brave New World working together as text, because 1984 is just driving home that, just the bleakness of the world that we live in, and the unremitting darkness and the totalitarian power of it. And Brave New World is kind of offering, well, this is, if you want to be comfortable in a 1984 world, this is the way, just have your testicles chopped off and take the tablets and you'll be fine.
Oh, man. I mean, it's too much. I mean, Orwell was Huxley's student, right, at one point at Eton, right? So he must have known about Brave New World.
Was he? Yeah, I don't know. I haven't yet seen anything to convince me that Orwell wasn't genuinely an okay guy. The only thing is he was so successful, and of course he was part of British intelligence, so that's a bit of a red flag. But he doesn't seem to me as anywhere near a clear-cut case of a social engineer.
Well, I think that he was revealing things. I mean, if you look at Animal Farm and some of these other books in 1984, I think he's trying to tell you something. I think that he was putting it out there as a warning. I don't think it was like one of these people who was part of the social engineers like Huxley.
You don't?
I never got that. Blair was an unusual guy too, because he was actually got into Eton on credit. He was in there on talent, whereas most of these Etonians were there as legacies. Their parents went there. So I think that he probably from a very early age felt like he was different than everybody else, which he was. He was actually naturally intelligent, so talented. Which anyway, I didn't get that from him. But I also want to talk about kind of the occult roots that lead up to the kind of modern, your discussion of Crowley and stuff like that, because I thought that was very interesting. These orders of woodcraft chivalry, the New Forest Coven that leads to Wicca, and there's one name that popped up that I know well that is Victor Benjamin Newberg, this kind of hapless follower of Crowley. But maybe you can talk about some of those, this kind of naturalism that very similar to the kind of Nazism, pre-Nazi, back to the soil, blood and soil kind of naturalism that is in the UK.
Yeah. Well, one theory I explore in the book, and it's kind of in the title to some extent, The Vice of Kings, is that the aristocracy are really barbarians in disguise, that they're brutalists. They have very brutal values, very primal values, and very brutalistic child-rearing practices, and in a very coarse behaviors. I mean, you see this in the old movies about Henry VIII or whoever, Roman emperors. They're incredibly coarse, self-indulgent, hedonistic, decadent, obviously violent, sexually lewd, no real refinement. And yet we have this idea of the aristocracy as the most refined of people. And I think this is the wolf in sheep's clothing, another example of this. But I think there's also a problem, because if the ruling class do have to assume an air of refinement, and part of it, I think, is an understanding of mimesis, is that if you rule people, they're going to admire you, and then they're going to want to imitate you. So if you're openly barbaric and brutal, they will imitate that, and you don't want that. You don't want your masses to be, savage, violent, uninhibited, unrestricted, fearless warriors.
Right, you want them docile.
It's the opposite of what you want. So there's two reasons to conceal your nature. One is so that you can appear benevolent and not generate too much hostility. But the other is mimesis, that if people imitate you, then they'll imitate your pretense, your cloak, which is to be very refined and a bit effete and a bit feminized and quite passive and overly civilized. But the problem with that is that, well, one thing, if you're constantly pretending to be something, you can end up becoming that. And the other is that your children will also imitate that, because you've got to be in public with your children some of the time, or a lot of the time even. And so they won't know necessarily that you're pretending. That will create a split in their psyches as well. But I'm thinking all this for the first time, so it might be a bit chaotic. But then how do you counteract that conundrum in terms of, you want to raise your children to be brutal, barbaric leaders so that they can continue to rule in your stead, but you've also got to maintain the illusion that you're not this way. And I think one of the things they came up with, in order to, obviously this relates to the hidden underlayer of these groups and these organizations in our society in terms of organized ritual abuse. That's when they create a space that they can be truly barbaric within, and their true colors show. And you can also see how it would become more and more exaggerated. Like, the more you have to pretend in your life, Jekyll and Hyde, the more kind of wild and unadulterated it becomes when you can finally let it out. But I think they also, beside that, which would have been going on with the children as well, brutalizing the children and initiating them into brutal rituals. Fox hunting would be an overt example, of course.
Boarding school is probably another one,
Right, boarding school. Yeah, I was going to say, you've got to come up with socially legitimate ways to toughen up your kids. And so, boarding school is one. But this is where the nature thing comes in, and I think it's interesting because we've really inherited it as a culture and as a collective, the whole natural values thing, and that intersects obviously with Wicca. It's about paganism worship, nature worship, but it also intersects, as I say, with barbarism, whatever the word is, and real primal behaviors. And so I think they came up with particular schools and particular, what you call them, regimes or movements, like the camping movement that I write about. The school I went to, Abbotsford, was a lot of outdoor things, a lot of nature. It wasn't nature worship per se, but as you read, the symbol of Abbott's home was a 5-pointed star.
Yeah, it's a pentagram, upwards pentagram. Right?
Yeah, the upward pentagram, and drawn very much in the way of the witchcraft with the overlapping lines. And I was quite astonished when I saw that, because I wasn't aware at the school of that symbol, and I wasn't aware that I was part of what I later discovered as this large scale promotion of and development of a certain value set that seemed, again, specifically for, I think, again, you got the two versions. You got the one that's for the elite and the aristocracy and their children as a part of the training, the conditioning, so that they can be prepared to rule. Right. And then you've got the sort of anesthetized version, which is just not for everyone because you need.
Right. It's like the difference between the Boy Scouts and the Bohemian Club. You know, so the children of the elite, Bush Jr., Bohemian Club, Molech, so-called, quote, mock ritual sacrifice, out in the woods, redwoods, real man's club, a lot of probably homosexuality as well, if you really read between the lines what Nixon said. So real kind of this barbarism or nature worship. And then you got the kind of Boy Scouts that everybody, all the kids, all the kind of lower classes get, which is, is kind of like milquetoast, whitewashed view of, rugged outdoorsmen, which isn't very rugged at all. But what goes on at the Bohemian Grove is off the chart. I mean, the Bohemian Grove is a offshoot of the Bohemian Club, which goes, which is downtown San Francisco, and it goes back to Bohemia, which I think is in present day Czechoslovakia, right? So
I don't know. Actually.
I think Bohemia was a place, but it was seen as, I think, what you're talking about. If my understanding is correct, Bohemia was this kind of more paganistic culture that doesn't exist anymore. But yeah, it's I think that here in the States, when I was reading your book, I was just looking. You kind of take this very UK view, and I was just transposing, like, okay, this is exactly what's happening in the United States.